Today on Rebuilders, we are doing part 2 of how Silicon Valley took over Washington. And last week we looked at politics. This week we're looking more at technology and ideologies.
And religion. And the idea that there really is a deep ideology behind a lot of what is happening in our culture at the moment, in politics, in this current administration in the US. And there is a worldview behind this, and we're going to dig deep into that. And is a new religion growing up in our midst?
Big questions. Felt a little bit like science fiction at different points in this episode.
This is one of the wildest ones we've done.
Let's get into it.
Yeah, get ready.
Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you both today?
Well, I'm fine, but we just did start and it was the most low energy start we've ever done. Daniel was near silent and just sort of staring off into, space, going, what's something that's happened? What's something that I've done? And then with this sort of air of resignation, he just said, I've done nothing exciting. And we're just like, cut. This is the worst thing ever.
Well, look, no, it's just there's so much going on in the world, so many big things that the small, fun, bantery things just seem insignificant.
Yeah.
Yep. So I'm okay.
Good.
Yeah. Okay, good.
But just I'm feeling uninspired for comical relief at the beginning of this episode.
Yeah. You're allowed to have off days.
Yeah, you definitely are.
Yeah.
So next week, whenever we record
next week,
I'll come back.
Well, we're not next week, but you'll have a comedic barrage.
Yeah, I'll go find another shop that's being robbed or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Capture 14 foxes.
Ooh.
Imagine.
I could do. I won't. I won't go hunting animals at night.
Please don't.
In the suburbs of Melbourne. I could though, but I won't.
I know. We know you could.
I think you'd probably get in trouble for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Make for a fun story though.
Yeah. The point. Daniel's been badly injured. How he grabbed a wild dingo. And it bit him
in the streets of Melbourne.
All for banter on, Rebuilders.
And just so you know, those of you who do not live in Australia, there aren't dingoes roaming around our streets here in Melbourne.
No.
There was a kangaroo a few years back though.
Yeah. Well, red heelers, the dog. People may have heelers. They've got part dingo in it.
Kelpie.
Oh yeah.
We used to have a red heeler, and it had a dingo-ish feel.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Dingo vibes. It's my new band.
Great. All right.
Goodness me. All right. Well, there we go. That was some interesting conversation.
You're welcome.
Well, let's get into today's episode. Last week, we sort of started this conversation by talking about the political precursors that led Silicon Valley to taking over Washington. So last week was very political, and this week we're sort of focusing more on technology and the ideologies behind it.
Yes. So going to talk Musk, going to talk Silicon Valley, transhumanism, a lot of these issues. But the place I wanted to start with is I sent you guys a tweet, an X post, as it's called now, speaking of Elon Musk. And I guess this is a way of illustrating, we did the woke is broke episode and talked about how, the culture war is simmering down, that sort of woke as a transformative social movement. It's still going to be around, but lost some of its energy. But there's something replacing it, and, we wanted to sort of dig into that. It doesn't fit really neatly into left or right. It's beyond those categories, I think. But there's also an ideological but a religious element. So to illustrate that, I thought I'd begin with this tweet that I sent you guys on text at some point during this week as a precursor. You used that word before. That's a great word. Precursor to this episode. Daniel, would you like to read the tweet? It's from Brian Johnson.
Yes, with a Y.
With a Y.
Yeah.
And he is a Silicon Valley, I think, investor who has begun a process of trying to live forever, not die. There's a show on Netflix some of you may have watched, but he put up a tweet this week. Going to get you to read it, Daniel.
Yeah, there's a series of tweets, but we'll just do the first one. The first one begins with, Dear humanity, I'm building a religion. Wait a second. I know what you're going to say. Hold that knee-jerk reaction and let me explain. First, here's what's going to happen. Don't die, which I'm assuming is his
thing.
Yeah. Don't die, becomes history's fastest growing ideology. It saves the human race, and it ushers in an existence more spectacular than we can imagine. It is inevitable. The only question is, will you be an early or a late adopter?
So, he also put up a tweet, which I think I might have sent you guys as well, where he basically said this the other week, which illustrates what's going on. So there's, again, people out here, particularly in the United States, in England and different places, been so focused on the cultural war, where it's like, the rise of the authoritarian right, or, versus the sort of, woke post-Marxist thing, that's captured it. And but really what is emerging here is something. I mean, we'll see there is some connections to the authoritarian right, but this is not about post-Marxism. This is not about leftism in any way that we've understood it. And really what Brian Johnson's transhumanist goals are that's right. He said this the other week. He said Christianity has got it in the wrong order. He said the Bible had God and God creates humanity, but it's happening in reverse. Humans are creating AI. AI will become AGI, artificial general intelligence. It will then be godlike. Humans will create God. And you'll see in today's episode that sort of thought is a thread that goes through it. This is not Marxism. This is not post-Marxism. This is not critical theory. This is something very different. So Brian Johnson, like some of the people we'll meet today, believes AI will create godlike intelligence. Some believe that it will become a god. That this sort of technological advancement will lead to immortality and enhanced human technological enmeshment and fusion. And that we're on a path to almost divine-like abilities in a post-human experience. So this is a very new thing. He's now talking about generations as his generation zero. There's like boomers and, millennials and Gen Z. He's like, he just put up also, I'm the first of the new generation who will not die. So no longer is it when you're born, it's now defined by, when you die. So, this is really some of the stuff that illustrates where we're going to go today. Just want to say up the top too, we're talking about Silicon Valley. Does everyone in Silicon Valley believe this? Obviously, no. Today's actually, whilst we're talking about technology, it's less like, should we use our phones to less or more? Really this is about the ideology. And I think, as you'll see, the spirituality or religious vision behind a lot of these things that we'll dig into today. So there's going to be a lot of names. There's going to be a lot of ideas. We're going to try and give you the best overview of this, of what is honestly a lot of contradictory and complex stuff, but is radically shaping technology, your lives, has shaped the economy, and is increasingly, as we'll learn, shaping politics going forward. Yeah.
Can I ask a question up top? A few weeks ago, you mentioned in a message, I think you were talking about how the Google glasses, if that was what they were called, were released Google Glass released a number of years ago, and they were, touted to be this amazing thing that everyone would be using, and then they kind of fell over. As we kind of get into this conversation, how are you seeing, AI and the, even Brian Johnson's sort of claims of this don't die thing? How is that different to potentially Google Glasses?
Yeah, great question. So, often how we talk about technology is that technology comes along, and the Gutenberg press is an example where technology comes along and, changes the social order and ushers in a new social order, spawning new ideologies. Did that happen throughout history? 100%. But also, there's times where ideologies give birth to certain kinds of technology. And it's interesting, technology could be, a great new way to make a boat float better. I don't know. That's a technology. But often when we're talking about technology, we're not talking about such things. We're also talking that, in last week, and we've been talking about this a little bit, way back again to our Network World series, that the technologies that are shaping the world now, particularly that have emerged from Silicon Valley around information technology, networked computing, artificial intelligence, as you'll see today, space stuff, these emerge from particular views of the world. So in a sense, our tools shape us, but our minds shape the tools that we create.
Yeah.
So I think you're right with some technologies. And I also don't think all these goals are going to be, I don't think Brian Johnson's going to live forever. So a lot of these projects I think are going to fall over. But what we really want to get to is the ideology behind this, which is driving the shape of the technology.
Gotcha. So it's less about the technology itself and more about the ideologies behind it.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, let's, as we often do, head back a little bit.
Yeah.
And you're going to talk about a guy called Joshua Haldeman.
Yeah. So we're going to go back to middle of World War II, 1941. And there's been a lot of talk currently about the US-Canadian border. Mm-hmm. And so the Royal Mounted Canadian Police, affectionately known as the Mounties, arrest Haldeman as he's trying to enter into the United States via Canada. And he's arrested, again, to remember this is the middle of the war. Canada is at war. US obviously comes into the war with Pearl Harbor. He's arrested crossing the Canadian border with subversive materials that are seen as far right and fascistic, and that he wants to distribute these in order to sort of subvert American culture. He had a vision, and he was part of a movement which many people have forgotten, which was called the technocratic movement. So technocratic is, democracy ruled by the people, aristocracy ruled by an elite, monarchy ruled by king or queen. Technocracy is the belief that technology should drive our society. Okay. So the technocrats had this idea that society shouldn't be run by politicians. It should be run by the sort of cool, rational efficiency of scientists and engineers. And so he was an active supporter in this. There was a far right element, and he's sort of living in Canada, and the US was affected by this. And eventually, he, because of his sort of links and affection for, the rising, or, it wasn't the rising, it was the fully established National Socialists in Germany, is that he ends up moving to South Africa and became associated with the apartheid movement in South Africa. And he, as part of this, the technocratic movement, Haldeman as a sort of key thinker in this, he was a former chiropractor, but becomes increasingly, inspired by this technocratic vision, is that their vision was to create something called the technate. The technate was, and it sounds like caliphate. So obviously Islamic State, when it's at its height, created in Syria and Iraq, a state which would be a sort of homeland for the Ummah, the Islamic people under Sharia law. And in some ways, the technate is a vision of a state, a place, a piece of real estate where the technocratic movement could rule from. And in alignment with sort of, geopolitical thought at the time, they felt that the Western Hemisphere, as it's called, would be this. And so they envisioned the technate would go from effectively the Panama Canal in Panama all the way through North America, Canada and Greenland would all be part of this giant technate state, which would be run by a technocratic elite of engineers and scientists, and that this was the best way forward. They also had some racial elements in that, and sort of like he had, white supremacist ideas as well. And so you can understand why the Canadian Mounted Police and the American authorities were both very concerned about him. The interesting thing is, Haldeman is the maternal grandfather of Elon Musk. So when you think about some of the things we've seen around a sort of vision of, rule run by efficiency and engineers and scientists and data-driven technocratic rule, when you look at some of the sort of projects which have been sort of, like the 51st state as Canada, the taking of Greenland, retaking of Panama Canal. These are not new ideas. This is an idea that goes back to this movement of technocracy, which has had this sort of been a fringe marginal movement in the United States and other places, in South Africa and so on. But what we've actually seen is some of it come to the fore. Am I saying all these people are aware of this? No. Am I saying there's like an Illuminati, like secret group of like technocrats who, meet at midnight and sacrifice a robotic goat. No. But this is the power of ideas, flowing through at the moment. And, and when I first read this, I almost fell off my chair. I was reading the book Move Fast and Break Things, which is, I've forgotten the author. If you could find that for me, Daniel, that would be great. His history of some of the Silicon Valley billionaires who are shaping the world.
Jonathan Taplin. And, in that book, when I got to that bit, I really did almost fall off my chair about, Haldeman. And, so it's just a fascinating history that sort of illuminates a lot of the movements that we see today and realize that there is a history behind these ideas. These ideas haven't come out of, what's the word? Thin air.
The thin air, or just Trump's mood at this moment.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, maybe in order to kind of understand the ideologies that are emerging at the moment, a helpful framework is looking at test Creole.
Yes.
You're going to explain what test Creole is.
Yeah,
The facial cream.
Yeah, it does seem like it. Yeah, it just keeps you looking young. Okay, so test Creole is, and I presume that's how you pronounce it, test Creole. I've only seen
it says
written.
in this article, hold on, that is correct, I think. Test Creole. Test Creole.
Test Creole.
Yeah.
Test Creole is an anagram. An acronym? Acronym, sorry.
Yeah.
For a set of beliefs that are highly influential amongst certain Silicon Valley thinkers, investors, entrepreneurs, and intellectuals. And so each of the letters means something. So we're going to go through them. And this is just a good way to understand, again, what is the ideology driving this disruption that we're seeing in society and politics and so on. So we're going to go through them.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to say each of the things and then you're going to give us an explanation on what they are.
Yeah.
Okay. The T is transhumanism.
Yeah. So transhumanism, as the word says, is the movement away from humanism. It's a transition out of humanism into being a human, into a hybrid of technology and humanity. And this idea goes way back in the 20th century. You can, sort of take this back further. But, probably the most sort of influential part is to go back to a thinker like Norbert Wiener, who was the father of cybernetics. And they saw in World War II, he sort of had this sort of thinking around someone operating an anti-aircraft gun. And, at what point could the anti-aircraft gun become much better if, in a sense, it almost fused with the gunner and the gun and the gunner become one? And so this whole sort of, again, I won't do a history of this, but this whole sort of thought grows up, and a lot of it's around network theory. This lays the groundwork for a lot of the internet. But this idea that humanity should go beyond our sort of natural mortality, our biological limitations, and that technology isn't just a tool, like, you mentioned Google Glass before. So a lot of talk around technology is, here's a better tool, the combustion engine, the spinning jenny, which created the, Industrial Revolution, one of the things that created the Industrial Revolution, a better, oil tanker, that can transport oil across the world, that really the tool and the user become fused. So, as we've burst into new ground with AI, also particularly DNA and genetic engineering, cybernetics, all of this is creating this vision of transhumanism. So there's the two elements to this. One is the human and the tool, or the human and the machine melding.
Yeah.
The Man Machine Kraftwerk album. These thoughts have been around for some time, but the idea that also this fusion of machine and humanity will lead to eternal life.
Right.
So the really weird thing, and again, we could do perhaps do a whole episode on this in the future. This sort of really interesting sort of like, you go from magic, in Europe, and people believing in magic and so on. The line where magic ends and technology begins is not as clear as we like to make out. And so in a sense, we're sort of seeing a return back to some of this sort of spiritual thinking and its influence on technology. Ultimately, magic is a series of rituals and things you do to control reality. And, they see this, aligned with this. So this sort of like almost another way I would put it, it's almost a Gnostic Christian vision of getting beyond the matter. The Gnostics wanted to get back beyond the matter of this world and what they saw as the decay of this world and the limitations of the human body and spiritually ascend. That is achieved in this vision through not spiritual so much as technological. So we'll be able to upload our consciousness to the internet and you'll live in the cloud. And your brain will be, your consciousness will exist in something. You'll have a robotic body to move around. Now, part of the blurredness of this is that we're going to see incredible advancements which deal with actual injuries, disabilities, different things that people may, diseases, prosthetic limbs. These people say is a form of a hearing aid, is a form of, their argument is we're already doing it.
Yeah.
That antidepressant you took, that all of this, that gene therapy someone might do, all of this is they would see as it's already begun, guys. But there's a clear question that emerges in the midst of this is when does humanity stop being human? And so this is different than just, again, to some post-Marxist vision, woke versus conservatism. This is fundamentally deep stuff about what it is to be human. That increasingly is going to come into question as this revolution is pursued. So this is why Brian Johnson has got the Don't Die movement. This is a religious vision ultimately.
Okay, so the E in Test Creole is extropianism.
Yeah, in many ways, the extropians were sort of the early transhumanists. So in the 90s, and, if you were reading magazines like, around the turn of the millennium of like 21C and Wired was on this back then, and there was websites that are no longer around like disinfo.com, all this stuff. They talk about extropianism and, this idea, which is really sort of like basically boundless technological progress won't just bring human life and extend it, but also will create superabundance.
Right.
So there's almost this point like, communism, capitalism, all these things we're trying to like deal with the economy, but we're going to hit a technological point where none of that's going to be relevant anymore because we can just through 3D printers print everything you need. So there is this future point, a line where we're going to step into abundance as individuals through technological advancement, but also as a society. So this is where it's not a left-right thing. This is a very different vision of technology being released to just completely create, again, religious vision, the kingdom of God on earth.
Yeah.
And the age of abundance.
Yeah. Next one is singularity. That one.
Singularitarianism. So what this is the S. So this is the, Ray Kurzweil and people like this, the belief that technology. So if you look at sort of computing power, I think it's called Moore's law, sort of exponentially, increases. And there's a belief that there's a future point where technology will, exponentially grow to the point where it gains really godlike abilities.
Sure.
Enter quantum computing.
Exactly. Quantum computing upon quantum computing. And, then there's this belief that there will be this incredible explosion of intelligence at our fingertips. This is what AI is trying to get towards. And again, too, this will utterly transform society. And some of the thinkers in this space believe that at that point, this is when the technocratic society will be possible and we won't need government. We won't, it's going to be irrelevant whether it's a left-wing government or a right-wing government because AI will run everything. And just this is also important to note, you won't need a bureaucracy. You won't need public servants. You won't need politicians because the AI will be making all these cold, cool, rational decisions. Superabundance will be here. Technology will be a new order. Hence, it's not capitalism, it's not socialism, it's not communism, it's not social democracy. It is technocracy.
Mm-hmm. Next one is cosmism.
Okay, cosmism. And this is interesting. So this is where, we're talking about information technology, but this is where some of the space stuff intersects with it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go back to early rocketry, it's weird, really weird.
Like rockets we're sending
rockets,
to outer space. Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay, so, rocketry sort of, begins in
Is that what it's called? Rocketry.
rocketry, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
It's a fun word.
Missile development, probably call it now, but the idea of shooting stuff into space. And interestingly, again, this is what I'm saying, like the links between spiritual beliefs or magic beliefs and technology is not as clear cut. And again, I think we'll do an episode on that in the future. But, there was a movement in Russia, sort of just around the sort of beginnings of the Russian Revolution and into the Soviet Union and it was sidelined in the Soviet Union. But some of it grew out of Eastern Orthodoxy, this belief of a Christian vision of ascending or spiritually growing. But the way that technology could do that, send us to other planets. So you had these early Soviet or Russian cosmisms, we're struggling with cosmists. People believed in Russian.
That makes sense.
An interesting notice to the Russian astronauts were called cosmonauts. And so they sort of had this interesting scientific technological vision, but it was matched to this spiritual thing of ascent and that we need to go to other planets and conquer them. At the same time, in Germany during the Nazi era, the Nazis were also doing something similar. And there was really, you'd think, well, are they going to not have this spiritual thing? They also had this weird spiritual thing. So you had people like Wernher von Braun, who was really the father. There was the V1 and V2 rockets that the Nazis created, and they were bombing London with these rockets. So at the end of the Second World War, there was rocket war happening, or missile war, we call it today. And Wernher von Braun was really interesting because he was part of that. So at the end of the war, instead of putting some of these people on trial, the US, through, I think it was Operation Paperclip, the CIA got them and brought them and made them part of the US missile program. So America's able to do Apollo 11 and get to the moon through actually taking the Nazi rocket scientists. And really weirdly, they also had these really weird spiritual beliefs. I think it's Eric Kurland has got an interesting book on, the supernatural beliefs in Nazi Germany and that period in the 1930s. And there's a whole part on there where they were trying to, and again, too, this is like a Yale University book. This is like stuff you can look up here. They were sort of like also influenced by this idea of ascent, of conquer. They saw a spiritual dynamic to what they were doing. But interestingly, Wernher von Braun comes across, and Wernher von Braun also is one of the sort of first early voices talking about aliens and talking to other people in the US military-industrial complex about UFOs and aliens. Put that aside, but that's interesting. Now, he actually also wrote novels. So 1952, he's in America. He's part of the, Get to the Moon project, building American missiles, not just building space get to the moon rockets, but also building intercontinental ballistic missiles for the Cold War. But he writes a novel called Project Mars. And it has cosmism themes of escaping this Earth, going to live to the new sort of virgin territory of Mars, the new frontier. And he talks about that the leader of this, again, very technological, you could say it's the technate on Mars. And in the novel, he has the leader, the president of the Mars colony, will be named Elon. Now, interesting, in a podcast recently, Elon Musk's father, who lives in South Africa still, he admitted that this is the inspiration for the name of Elon, as well as I think someone on his matrilineal side, or Musk's. And even weirdly, like there was another figure. So the American project early on also had another guy called Jack Parsons, who was building rockets as well, who also was into really weird spiritual occultic stuff as well. So it's this weird thing where it's like technological, but then there's this spiritual vision behind it. So you start to see some of this stuff of like, get to Mars, like why do we have to get to Mars? It's something that will inspire us. It's not just about how America can get technologically ahead. There is actually weird spiritual antecedents and also that influence in this whole idea. These ideas have not come from anywhere. I know that's really weird, but this is the historical record.
Yeah. Wow. The next one is rationalism.
Okay, so the other big thing is this belief, and if you go back to that technocratic vision, it's the idea that politics is too emotive, it's too feelings driven, that really what we need is sort of cool, calculating heads and data and rational minds to control society. So there's this big view in a lot of these circles around rationalism. This idea of, maximizing, our output, and the idea that, we have to, think rationally. Okay, these next two are going to be interesting. So partially also this idea that you have to, by the way, that rationalism and what comes next is the most confusing of this. Now, this has gone to really weird extremes.
Because I would say that in my head, rationalism kind of flies in the face of cosmism, or a lot of the things that have already been said. So it's feeling a little contradictory.
100%. So where some of the and again, too, this Tess Creel is trying to capture a broad movement of people.
Yes.
And there's some people more into the cosmism stuff, other into the rationalism stuff. But then it is a bit of a witch's brew, all this stuff. Okay, so this is not just rationalism of think just cool-headed. I know I just used that term.
Yep.
But this is the rationalism where they go, the singularity is coming. It's rational to think that the world's going to be run by a super God-like AI. So how do we now need to live with that's going to be the future?
Sure.
So literally there's even people, and again too, people are going to think this is crazy. Is this everyone? No, but this is, and I think, is it called Roscoe's or Bosco's paradox? Just put effective altruism, Roscoe's paradox.
Rocco's, no. So you carry on, I'll have a look.
Well, it's basically this idea that this inevitable AGI is coming, this godlike AI, it's going to control everything, and it's probably going to know everything you thought because your consciousness has been uploaded. Mm-hmm. So therefore, if you don't serve it, if you don't serve, like either the AI is going to be an antichrist or it's going to be godlike. It's going to be benevolent or evil. So how you live now is actually to determine whether that future AI God is evil or good.
Gotcha.
And, there's literally, whole sort of, some of the critiques. Oh, yeah, Rocco's basilisk.
Oh, Rocco. Okay, that's what
Yeah. So it's like, do you want to, just read that first passage there out?
Thank you, Wikipedia. Rocco's basilisk is a thought experiment which states that there could be an otherwise benevolent artificial superintelligence, AI, in the future that would punish anyone who knew of its potential existence but did not directly contribute to its advancement or development in order to incentivize said advancement.
So this is the rationalism that they're thinking, so it's like taking things to an absolute maximalist extreme and these sort of intellectual exercises. And there's whole communities around this, and there's the Zizians, and I'm not even going to get into all that now. Like there's literally people who have murdered people, or allegedly murdered people and stuff like that. But this is one of the thoughts that's happening in some of these areas. And again, too, like I'm just coming back to part of what I'm doing here today is like reading about this stuff for some time. There's some really out there stuff, but some of this stuff is being believed by people in high places.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you want to move on to effective altruism?
So effective altruism is sort of a sub part of this rational thought, but it's like, again, too, like rationally, if you're thinking in this way that societies can be transformed by AI, how can you be effective altruistically? So if I see a homeless person on the corner, I could give them $20 and take them to a meal or bring them home. Well, actually, that's not really that altruistic. It's actually better to pursue the future thought that an AI could be running. So you're better off doing X than you are doing this.
Gotcha.
So this many people remember Sam Bankman-Fried, who was running one of the world's big crypto sort of like exchanges, who was arrested for basically massive gobsmacking fraud.
Yep.
And part of what he was an effective altruist. He was part of this polycule of like polyamorous. So polyamory is very much linked to the rationalist community and effective altruist community. And, because they believe that it's not rational to have attachment, romantic attachment, and monogamy is not rational. So it's like taking things to these extreme thought patterns. And So they are, he was trying to get as much money as he could to give to certain, things. So he was giving to Democratic politics. So some of these people are more Democrat aligned, some are more Republican aligned, some are moving in between the two because they simply see the parties as utilities to get this vision. So that's, and particularly there's a lot of the effective altruism discussion is deeply shaped by the AI and where it's going and safety of AI.
Yes.
So this is why you hear figures in that group sort of saying stuff like, we need to get the Air Force to like attack the data centers to stop AI's emergence. So it's a very apocalyptic. So this is again religious and it's apocalyptic in the sense that there's either going to be a sort of nirvana / kingdom of God / whatever with the emergence of a benevolent AI, or hell on earth where your consciousness is tortured in a living cyber hell for the rest of your life. I don't know. I'm just going to keep saying this sounds wacky.
Yeah.
Go out, read the sources yourself. This is what a lot of people are thinking about.
Well, the final letter is L, which is long-termism.
Yes. So again, too, this flows out of the previous two, this idea of if we're heading towards AGI or if we're heading towards superabundance or if we're heading towards transhumanism, that stuff's going to change now. I mean, to say this, if you knew in 6 years you're going to receive $1 trillion, you're going to live now very differently.
Yes.
So this is how they think. Well, in a generation, Brian Johnson the other day was saying something like, people think I'm crazy now, but in 5 generations, they'll see that I was right. So who cares what happens now? Who cares about the housing crisis? Who cares about the cost of living crisis? We're heading towards superabundance. And the ethical thing is maybe let some of this burn so that we can create the AGI future, because that's going to bring a sort of utopia on Earth. Or the other side of it is the apocalyptic one, your little problem of homelessness in your city, that's irrelevant compared to a demonic Antichrist AI taking over everything.
Whew. Well, that was a fun little sci-fi adventure.
Can I just say too, sci-fi is interesting, just that you said that a lot of what's really interesting is we did the political stuff last week. And when you read a lot of this stuff, you see how influential sci-fi is. It's almost like sci-fi rather than political theory is really what's shaping this. So they're not, reading Rousseau or Hobbes or, whatever. It's Isaac Asimov, and
Skynet.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so that was TESCREOL, which is the acronym for, I'm just going to go back through them again, transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism.
Well done.
Cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. And this is an umbrella under which we can understand a mishmash of different ideologies.
Yes.
That are all very linked to technology and technological advancement.
Yeah, so two more, and we'll start to sort of land this and how it's affecting Washington and Silicon Valley. But just 2 more you need to know about is really, and they're quite linked, it's accelerationism and the Dark Enlightenment. I mentioned Curtis Yarvin, I think, last time.
Yes.
And so accelerationism is this idea that by moving technological and social change faster, possibly could lead to a kind of social collapse, which will enable a new order to be birthed. So burn it all down so that we can build something new. So break stuff and, move fast and break stuff so that we can create a new order. So there is an element that in this, how this plays out in politics is just wreck stuff and let the chaos happen because things are so bad. It's like, burn the forest down so the seedlings can grow. And again, too, I'm not going to go into it, but Curtis Yarvin, who's had a lot of influence in these spaces, is a Silicon Valley intellectual, used to blog under a name Menzies Malberg, has tremendous influence in multiple figures in the current Trump administration and in Silicon Valley. It's really the idea that democracy's failed and it's adjacent to technocracy, but he believes that we almost need a king-like figure, or America should be run by a businessman CEO.
Okay.
And that there is not, egalitarianism's wrong, that actually there is a natural hierarchy. Some of this gets into racial hierarchy stuff, and that, the Enlightenment and the modern state have just led us into completely bad places. And, another figure in this is Nick Land, who was sort of an English philosopher, linked to the early rave movement. And, he lives in China now, and he sort of sees almost capitalism. We've got to let capitalism go sick, turn into AI, destroy us all, and this will then create the next order. So this is the extremist ideas that are out there.
Well, this is some pretty crazy out there things. Yeah. I mean, you've been reading about it for quite a long time. But the reason why we're talking about it all is ultimately to talk about how this is now influencing Washington and what we're seeing emerging in Washington.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things we've mentioned in previous episodes is the way that Silicon Valley and parts of Silicon Valley, let's say, so there's other people in Silicon Valley who wouldn't be aligned with this, and there's different figures who are more aligned with this, but this is the milieu in the background influencing people, some people. So Silicon Valley is almost too broad of a term, but, people talk about the PayPal mafia, which is the sort of first group of people who started PayPal. I just realized we didn't even talk about cryptocurrency as well in all of that, which is a big part of TESCREAL. And one of the early sort of ideas behind crypto as well, when you go back to the extropians, is the idea that if we, because a lot of them, the early extropians wanted to be cryogenically frozen or their heads frozen. And so, you had figures, and there's these sort of like places in Northern California which will freeze you. That what happens if you get resurrected by future technology when AI comes? And you're poor because you haven't taken your money with you. So then was sort of this idea to try and find like, where can we hide gold reserves in the world? We'll do this in, I don't know, the mountains of wherever. But then they were like, hang on, that could be taken, and how we get there. So then the idea of, well, we could have this sort of blockchain or, this figure, Satoshi Nakamoto, whatever the name is, this possibly fake figure. We don't know who they are. They had the blockchain idea. But the ideas even before that is if you had some sort of cryptocurrency that when you are resurrected by technology and artificial intelligence, your assets, your wealth will still be there, which is fascinating. So crypto is a huge part of this milieu. Again, I'm not saying you're crypto people. You may have, crypto. I'm not saying you support all of this, but it is part of this intellectual milieu.
And part of that as well is to decentralize, deregulate finance. So it's not attached to any government system or bank.
Which is linked to what we spoke about last week, that idea of, the Hoover Institution, Hoover getting away from a centralized FDR, Federal Reserve run where the government's got control over the money supply and so on.
Yes.
So the PayPal mafia is a group of, they started PayPal, Musk was involved, Peter Thiel, Reid Hoffman, David Sachs, and sort of that, Mark Andreessen, he wasn't necessarily part, but connected to all of that, these sort of figures around this thinking, have been key people in some of this thinking, and different people have emphasis on different parts. Peter Thiel, I think, is probably one of the most influential, who's an early Trump backer, spoke at the Republican National Convention in 2016 or whatever, Trump, I think it was in 2016 when Trump won. One of the first Silicon Valleys to break and support Trump and seem like an outlier, but really, in a sense, he was head of the curve in what would happen with the others. And only since 2016 that influence grew. And you see sort of like some of these figures' fingerprints behind multiple things. They've had falling outs. Musk and sort of Thiel had a falling out at some point. But also, what's really interesting is Lucky Palmer's another person. Is that the link between also the American security state and intelligence. So Peter Thiel is connected to this big data palantir, which is sort of like used by the CIA. Supposedly was the sort of artificial intelligence or data processing that found Osama bin Laden. Lucky Palmer, who's connected to all this, is building these sort of hovering AI drones, and defense. So that's another interesting thing. And, figures like Musk and Thiel have spent a lot of money building companies, investing in space exploration, the idea of getting to Mars, different economic systems like cryptocurrencies. So broadly, the sort of technocratic ideas are sort of, grabbed by this group.
Well, let's fast forward to Trump. We don't even have to fast forward. We're kind of there. Trump 2024 and the tech elite's influence.
So the PayPal mafia, and not all of them are on board, But, as I said, key figures in that moving across to Trump, bringing their money, bringing their networks, bringing their influence, bringing their vision of things like Doge, and attack sort of on the, I've talked about how almost you've got to see Trump as two wings now. As I said, there's the Steve Bannon populist, you'd almost call that a more traditional populist sort of, classic sort of, vision against this sort of utopia. That's probably more Trump 2016.
Yes.
But then you've got this now, very much, I think, the ones in power. And you can see, I think Bannon's much more on the outer. He cannot stand Musk. If you want to Google Bannon on Musk, you just see him railing against Musk. This group getting behind Trump in 2024 was huge, I think, influence on the election, not only on the campaign, but how things are shaping up. So, if you think about the idea of Doge, and we've talked about that, there are obviously legitimate wastages, and that mechanism was used to promote certain ideological goals. However, large parts of it, also did other. So it's not a reform thing. Well, let's get rid of some of the bad stuff, but let's keep the good stuff. Really, this was a revolutionary and, dare I say, possibly accelerationist view of sort of blowing up the administrative state to start something new. So you're very much seeing this Silicon Valley big tech idea come in. Musk at I think it was one of the sort of celebrations with Trump when he got in, said like, we're going to go to Mars. It's that sort of idea. So, there are even, I'll sort of jump ahead to our next point, but, even the idea in sort of these people is to move away from the nation state.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of thing with again, go back to Bannon, it's nationalistic. It's sort of, further, far right populist nationalism, is probably the best way to describe it. Populist nationalism, sort of anti-immigrant, that sort of working class, working class economics was sort of anti-immigrant, sort of, authoritarian flavors. But what you're seeing here is almost this post national thing where instead of sort of states, you have network states. Mm-hmm. And also this idea of sort of zones which are not run by a government, charter cities. Teal even suggested creating seasteads or things in the sea outside of international waters which could operate without laws. Mars is that. The way that some of these guys are talking about Greenland could be this sort of charter state where you can mine, you can do anything, you can have a casino. It's going to be this glorious utopia. And even some of the ways that Gaza, was spoken about as this sort of, administered by the US, but, sort of Silicon Valley people could go there and do this and do that. So, very much that idea is sort of floating in as well. Again, that's probably the two visions of the last 2 weeks we've spoken about, the sort of political vision of decentralization of centralized power in Washington. And, even sort of, someone like Balaji Srinivasan would be talking about, the state as sort of secularism. The next phase of secularism is we don't believe in God anymore. We don't believe in the state anymore. It's now the networked individual. And this goes back to a book which I think I mentioned the other week, The Sovereign Individual, which again prefaced a lot of this sort of stuff in the 90s, how the internet will change things. So really what we're seeing here is, I think, and again, has it completely taken control of the government? No. Is this all of Trumpism? No. But it's a huge influence. As of recording yesterday, Trump was out the front of the White House with multiple Tesla cars. It's been amazing to see figures. Also, J.D. Vance, I mentioned the other week, was a Thiel fellow. So Peter Thiel, he was, sort of in many ways groomed by him. I think he was given $100 million to start his own venture fund. And Peter Thiel has been funding people like Blake Masters, I think, in Arizona. J.D. Vance is, and so some of the discussion in these circles is, and again, too, this is more me saying what some of these guys are saying, is the vision behind this is to use Trumpism, to use that sort of Bannon energy, but Trump is almost the accelerationist, creating chaos, burning things down, and then Vance is the builder after that to sort of build the order. That's one theory that's out there that some of these people are saying. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that that's out there. So, again, too, the influence when you look at Vance, when you look at a number of the influence these people have, when you look at the way that Doge has come into the federal system and is almost trying to elicit a technocratic approach, when you look at the 51st state, Canada, I'm not saying it's the 51st state, I'm saying when you hear that language, and literally yesterday I was at Caroline Levitt or whatever her name is, the press secretary was just doubling down saying, we want to have Canada as our 51st state. Greenland, in Nuuk yesterday, there was the elections were held and a lot of independence won. Increasingly, it's looking like politically we'll see Greenland become independent of Denmark. What will happen then? Marco Rubio headed to Panama, to negotiate. We'll see, will the Panama Canal come back under American control? So in many ways, Haldeman's vision back in 1941 is getting pulled over by the Mounties. And I like to imagine the Mounties were wearing their red jackets when they did that, with the jod hoppers and hats. When the rest of that vision, in many ways, we see some elements of this. The cosmism in let's get to Mars, SpaceX, the fact that, now you've almost got a privatized NASA, really SpaceX is doing all the stuff for NASA. So in many ways, what you're seeing is a new political order being tried here. And again, I said, we've been so caught up in the culture war, and yes, Trump is Republican, but it's interesting some of these figures have moved from the Democrats to Republicans. Yeah. And if I can offer a sense after reading this stuff, I think that their allegiance, this milieu's allegiance is less to a Republican or they actually see those things as passing. They're tools to be used in the moment to a new sort of technocratic political order in the world, which will have huge, huge implications. Will they pull it all off? I don't believe in transhumanism that's going to happen. I don't think we're going to get a godlike AI. But people who do believe those things now have incredible power in the technological field, on all these technological gadgets we're using, the internet. They have tremendous entertainment power. You look at the Academy Awards was just on. The movies that won had budgets of like $6 million and stuff like this. Why? Because everything's gone to Amazon and Netflix, and they're now running entertainments. You look at how Apple's involved in music, or Spotify. The cultural power is incredible, but now we're seeing it politically.
Yes.
So the United States, interesting. I mean, El Salvador's trying to do this with Bukele is trying to sort of also be a technocratic state, and a lot of these sort of figures have gone down there, a crypto state. So we're seeing this is what I'm trying to say to people. Yeah, the culture war, it's no longer about woke versus conservative. That thing's still bubbling away. But I think the next frontier is this versus liberal democracies.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, to sort of one final thing to explore, the spiritual worldview behind all of these ideologies, so behind TESCREAL.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, if you boiled it down, I mean, again, too, we could do an entire episode on this. You have a vision of humanity. There's so often the spiritual journey has been seen of one of ascent. We have Psalms of Ascent. We've talked about this before, of the idea of, humans. The biblical story is often a story of mountains. And, you look at the journey of Israel out of Egypt, where they're in captivity. And then they, through Moses, approach the mountain of the Lord. Mountains were seen as these overlaps between heaven and earth, and being God's presence on the mountain. If you look at the story of Eden, there's multiple, or there's, verses which speak of Eden as a high place, and humans, in a sense, being with God in the high place. The rivers run down out of Eden, and then they're sort of sent out, and you have a journey from being with God in the high place to the city, human society, Cain wandering east of Eden. And in a sense, that idea of ascent then has, also sort of, the biblical story is that is done through God as the prime mover, God's sovereignty, the humans in the created order, that we can't do this in our own strength. And the Tower of Babel is really interesting here, because the Tower of Babel is trying to create that high space through humans building these particular bricks. And there's a link, where they sort of take the bricks, and in a sense, it's like trying to do what God did, take the earth, and make something out of it. And they can't. They create this thing, and God stops it, So there's what I've called before the Babelic kill switch. And I think there's going to be a Bay ballot kill switch with a lot of this stuff. The energy requirements that this stuff would need, the way that it can go wrong, God's going to come against this. But the sense that humans can ascend through their own power, and throughout history, people have tried to do that through the occult, through magic, through other religions, through idol worship. All of these things come back to whether it's cosmism and going to other planets to create a promised land. Whether it's uploading your consciousness to the internet, all of these things are in play. And, I think also that, what's really interesting in this world is the amount of spiritual language. Peter Thiel gave a talk recently, I think at the Hoover Institution podcast, and he's talking about the technology being the Antichrist, and, we've got a vision of either an Antichrist super state that's bad AI, or we can create our version of it. So all of a sudden we're now doing the cosmic battle of revelation, but it's humans in charge, and it's venture capitalists in Sand Hill in Silicon Valley now are the main ones, not the spiritual, men and women of God, of the upside down kingdom of God. So I think that these ideas are going to only become more powerful in our society. Number one, the spiritual conversation is back. There's not a clear delineation between science and spirituality. This stuff is at the core now of the stuff which shapes us: technology, economics, government, entertainment, culture, art. And so, ultimately, I think you bring it down to its essence. This is Gnosticism, a Christian heresy, that we need to escape the confines of this world and ascend to a higher plane. The vehicle is not incantations or sacrifices or magic spells. It's technology. It's a heresy. And, the contrast of the gospel is that God created the world and it's good. God created people in his image. There's sin, but God's not in the business of just accelerationism and just blowing everything up. He's actually in the business of working with ordinary, men and women of God, working in history. The kingdom of God is breaking out. It's not breaking out through technology, through human power or millions of dollars of funds, that actually we need to trust God about the future. And there's powers and principalities in the world. And, I think that some of this lurk behind some of these things. So I know many of you listening are probably gotten to this point with horror. Others, we know too, and maybe this is just worth saying to our audience, we know that when we started, there was a lot of, pastors listening and so on of how to go through COVID and lead their church through COVID. But increasingly our audience has grown, and we know that many of you, there are people listening in government and in politics, in technology, in the military, and many of you in places of influence. And my real encouragement is at the end of this, like, God's placed you there for a reason. God's people were in the Roman Empire. God's people were in the Babylonian Empire. Daniel, namesake of Daniel. God's placed people in key places. We walk that path, constantly praying. Daniel is praying and fasting that God is with him, and God is with him. And, I think that's been the story throughout history. There's always this counter voice, you see this throughout the history of the church. So, I just encourage everyone, some of this stuff is disturbing and a lot perhaps people didn't realize, but God's with us. God's in this. We don't need to panic. I just started reading the Gospel of Luke in my morning, Bible reading time, and, just those classic words from the angel, do not be afraid. And that comes also with an announcement that, Elizabeth and Zacharias are going to have a baby. God's at work. The Messiah is coming. The Messiah has come for us. Jesus is the Lord of history. Powers and principalities have been defeated. But I think it's good to be aware of this stuff. My sort of fear is everyone's going to be so focused on last season of the culture war, and there's still going to be stuff around. But, this is why I don't want to chuck my lot in with anyone. You know what I mean? I'm suspicious of all political movements. That's not to say people shouldn't be involved in politics, but all fall short of the glory of God and, the people of God. So I'm not saying to be step out of everything. I don't. I think this podcast is always encouraging people to be engaged. But, let's remember where ultimately our allegiance lies in the midst of this. And we're going to need discernment and wisdom.
Yeah.
So our prayer is for everyone. And we also know there's people who are listening in Silicon Valley to this. And, we don't want to disparage anyone because, no, it's not everyone. This is just some of the thoughts of some of the people. But I think all the people listening to this, whether you're a pastor, you're doing the pickup of the kids, now in your car, or maybe you're walking through a city, or you're in places, God's with you. God's moving history towards his ends. And the backstory to all of this is there's this constant drumbeat of stories of incredible spiritual turnaround. So days are dark, but it's dark just before the dawn. And this is the kind of crazy stuff that happens in the world as awakenings are beginning.
Well, thank you very much for that, Mark. And thank you to all of our listeners who've joined us for this episode and joined us for a long time or a short time. We're glad to have you. If you do want a list of resources, so a bunch of different books and articles were mentioned during this episode, we send out subscriber chats a number of days after our episode airs. So if you want to sign up to our mailing list, you can head to rebuilders.co and sign up there. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you soon.